Buenas tardes con todas, con todos. Les agradecemos muchísimo estar aquí. El Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador está muy gustosa de presentar al profesor Steve King, que ha tenido la generosa actitud, la gentileza de, en el marco de una agenda tremendamente apretada, darse un tiempito para venir a visitarnos, por lo cual le quedamos, profesor, muy agradecidos. Estamos de corazón agradeciéndole este esfuerzo que está haciendo. Sabemos que está a esta altitud, además, haciendo un esfuerzo sobrehumano para ir de lado a lado con sus conferencias. Steve fue profesor asociado de Economía y Finanzas de la Universidad de Western Sydney y ahora está en Kingston, en Inglaterra. Es autor del libro que ha sido utilizado por muchos de nosotros desde hace muchísimos años, Debunking Economics, Reconstruyendo la Economía. Y su más reciente libro es ¿Podemos evitar otra crisis financiera? Y esto hace referencia a que Steve fue de los pocos economistas que había predicho, que había venido alertando sobre la inminencia de la crisis, de la implosión financiera de la crisis que el mundo tuvo en el año 2008. Tiene más de 70 publicaciones académicas sobre temas tan diversos como la inestabilidad financiera, el proceso de creación de dinero, los defectos matemáticos en los modelos convencionales de oferta y la demanda, la aplicación de la física a la economía, las finanzas islámicas, el papel del caos, la teoría de la complejidad en la economía. Su trabajo ha sido traducido al chino, al alemán, al ruso. El blog de Steve pone a disposición del público su enfoque heterodoxo de la economía. Tiene más de 11.000 suscriptores, más de 50.000 lectores únicos cada mes. Esperamos que ahora, con una nutrida presencia como la de ustedes, puedan aumentar también el número de sus seguidores. Yo les ruego que me acompañen en un aplauso de agradecimiento a Steve por su presencia.
Thank you. Okay. Well, of course, I have described my ambition in life as dying after I've killed neoclassical economics. And that's something which most people in the public accept economics the same way they accept physics or chemistry or biology as a science. And I've been arguing since I was your age, since I was 18 in 1972, that this theory was invalid. Now, those arguments were not something you would find in the newspapers until after the financial crisis in 2008. And now you can find articles like this by the economics editor of the Guardian newspaper in the UK, saying orthodox economics is like the medieval Catholic Church, thinking it has all the answers, using Latin to obscure itself from the public, and being a belief system rather than a science. And I'm pointed out by in the articles one of those heretics, and because I was a heretic, I was one of the people who anticipated the financial crisis back in 2008. So this is a very, very vigorous attack on conventional economics, and as you might expect, it raised the anger of quite a few neoclassical economists. So I'll leave you to look at the notes of this slide to actually see what Larry Elliott had to say. But one of his points was to say the theory is based upon highly questionable assumptions. And there was a reply by economists from the London School of Economics and a couple of other institutions accusing Elliott and all the critics of having a dismal ignorance of the dismal science. And their argument was that the critics misunderstand the role of mathematics and assumptions. And they say where they complain our models are unrealistic and have absurd assumptions. And they make the analogy, well, the London Tube, the map of the London Underground transport system, is also unrealistic and makes absurd assumptions. And they say if it didn't make those assumptions, you couldn't use it. Because it abstracts from what is unnecessary, it tells you all you need to know how to get around London. And they defend the economic theory on exactly the same basis. They ignore the unnecessary to focus on the essential so you can understand how the economy operates. That's their explanation. And one thing I want to have you remember in their defence is this final sentence they wrote. Economic models help us find our way through complex data in a complex world. Okay. Well, let's look at the London Tube map, which is what they're using to defend their own assumptions. And that's, has anybody here been to London? You've used the tube? Yeah, that's about the best thing about London, isn't it? Okay. Now you get around with the map because the map tells you what suburbs are on what train lines. So if you want to go to Lambeth North, you know you go on the Bakerloo line. If you want to get to Southwark, you have to be on the Jubilee line. It tells you the rough geographic layout, so which suburbs are north of which suburbs, which ones are west, and so on. And it tells you where the lines intersect. So you know if you're coming from the northern line, you have to change at Waterloo to get to the Jubilee line. So, but it leaves out topography, it leaves out precise distances, it ignores roads, etc., etc. So it leaves out what you don't need to know and tells you what you do need to know. And that's the essence of making simplifying assumptions. That's what they should do. Now, what about Ptolemy's map of the universe? The map that said the Earth is the centre of the universe, and the suns and the stars and the planets rotate around us. There's that map. Now that map assumes that the nearest object to Earth is Moon, which is pretty okay. The next nearest object is Mercury. Then Venus. Finally the Sun. And that's the orbits that the planets are supposed to follow. They're on perfect circles that are almost centred on the Earth. And to explain why the planets go in the opposite direction, the planets are on other circles that orbit on the circles. Are they simplifying assumptions? No, they're complicating assumptions. Then we look back at them, we'll say they're crazy assumptions because we know the planets don't move that way. This is the actual motion of the planets around the Sun, and of course we're one of the planets. It's much simpler. So the Ptolemaic map is not a set of simplifying assumptions. It's a set of complicating assumptions needed to make a false paradigm appear to fit the data. And that's what neoclassical assumptions themselves are like. So I want to start with one of the key assumptions of conventional economics, and that is that marginal cost rises. All your micro textbooks start with the assumption of rising marginal cost. The empirical data shows that most corporations have constant or falling marginal cost. And the last person to discover this was Alan Blinder, who was at one stage a vice president of the American Economic Association and a vice chairman of the Federal Reserve. In other words, an extremely establishment economist, not a heretic, not a radical, not a critic. But he set up a research project which involved interviewing major corporations in the northeast corner of America to find out why prices were sticky, which is one of the components of the so-called new Keynesian macroeconomic models. They assume prices don't change all that rapidly. And he wanted to say, well, what's the basis of the assumption? Why don't firms change prices rapidly? So he commissioned this survey, designed it himself, and he employed PhD students in economics to go and do face-to-face interviews with senior managers in about 500 American companies. A very, very big survey. And this is his conclusion about what the actual costs were of these real companies. The overwhelmingly bad news for economic theory is that apparently only 11% of GDP is produced under conditions of rising marginal cost. Firms report having very high fixed costs, roughly at 40% of their total cost of production per unit. And many more companies state they have falling rather than rising marginal cost curves. They said maybe they didn't understand what we were saying, but their answers paint an image of the cost structure of the typical firm that is very different from the one immortalised in textbooks. So, this is how he summarised his results. And by the way, Alan Blinder might be a good economist, he is a terrible artist. Okay. This is his drawing. His visual summary of marginal costs for all the corporations he interviewed. So on the left-hand side you have firms reporting smooth transitions in their marginal cost. On the right-hand side you have firms reporting jumps in their marginal cost. But fully 41% of firms said their marginal cost fell. 48% said they were constant, and only 11% said their marginal costs rose. Now, he also did this major table summarising all the results. And just to take you through some of the major features of that survey, if you think about the supply and demand model, one exercise you get as students is move the supply curve and see where the demand curve moves to. So as soon as you change supply and change demand, the price changes. And you think that's happening all the time. He found that most firms only change their prices maybe 1.5 times a year on average. Prices change very, very rarely. In fact, there were many contracts that were fixed price. More than 1/4 of contracts fixed the price for periods of 1 to 5 years. Nothing like what you see in the textbook. Most sales were to other businesses. Rather than profit maximising firms selling to utility maximising consumers, which is the model you get, 70% of sales by firms were to other firms. So their motivations weren't utility maximisation, there's something different there as well. And fixed costs for most corporations were 44% of the average total cost of each product being sold. And that's the most important point, falling marginal cost. Now let's do a map of that empirical reality. What do you draw? And I've just jumped ahead of it. I'm very tired from too many presentations, by the way, so I'm going out of sequence a couple of times here. You could argue that Blinder's results were an aberration, a bad sample. But you know, when you see results of political opinion polls in the newspapers, they're surveying maybe 1,000 people in Ecuador out of what, 17 million? Tiny sample, but still empirically, statistically reliable. Blinder worked out the corporations he surveyed were accounted for 7% of America's GDP. That's a huge sample. And it also happens that Blinder did not know this, probably still doesn't know it, but there have been 30 or 40 similar research projects in the past. Every last one of them has found marginal cost fell. And my favourite was done in 1952 by these two economists. And what they did was they sent a paper survey out to corporations, not face-to-face like Blinder did, and they sent them this drawing, a set of drawings of what their average cost might look like. And this one has rising marginal cost, rising total cost all the way. This has rising average cost all the way. The only one of those drawings, which is like your textbook, is number 3. And that shows average costs falling for a while and then rising, okay? Which would be high fixed costs with rising marginal costs. You might say 4 looks a bit like the textbook, but the point of curvature is too far out. And 5, also, the point of curvature is too far out compared to your textbooks. Now 6, 7, and 8 look nothing like your textbook. So, 334 firms responded to the survey. These are the number of firms that chose each of those drawings. One company out of 334 chose the textbook drawing. One. 203 chose number 7. 2/3 of them chose that style. If you're generous, you can call curves 3, 4, and 5 like the textbook. That gives you 5% of the firms surveyed. But 95% of them said marginal costs, or the total costs either fall all the way out to capacity or fall almost all the way out and then rise near capacity. And for a comprehensive survey of all these surveys, there's an excellent book by the post-Keynesian economist Fred Lee summarising these survey results about what the actual empirical costs are of firms. So let's make a simplifying assumption based on that data. If that many firms, between 1 and 10 and 1 and 20, between 9 out of 10 and 19 out of 20 firms report they have constant or falling marginal cost, and only 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 say they have rising marginal cost, and the simplifying assumption is to ignore the ones with rising marginal cost. And if you also know that fixed costs are roughly half total costs at the normal scale of output, then here is a simplifying map. This is the London Tube map of the actual cost structure of real corporations. Marginal cost is constant all the way out. Average fixed cost falls in a rectangular hyperbola. You're dividing fixed amount of costs against more and more unit output. Average total costs are the sum of the two, and at the scale of operation of most corporations, marginal cost is slightly above average fixed costs. That summarises the data that all these surveys have found. Now, look at what you get in the textbooks. What textbook do you use here, by the way? Mankiw? Or Varian? Huh? Mascalel? You poor bastards. I use Mascalel as a doorstop. That's the most practical thing you can do with it. Anyway. Now this is what, I know that Mankiw is a more childish version of Mascalel, okay? But they're all childish because they all make totally false assumptions. Not just simplifying, but wrong. They choose the exception and call it the rule. So here is one of the examples from Mankiw's slides. He has the average cost and marginal cost curves for the company called Thirsty Thelma. Now, who's been shopping at Thirsty Thelma's recently? Anybody tried their coffee or their orange juice? Simple reason you don't, it doesn't exist. It's an imaginary example. Why do they use imaginary examples? Because there are no real ones that look like their drawings. If you actually had an empirically based science and the curves they drew were based on empirical data, they would be showing you IBM's cost curves, Ford's cost curves, General Motors cost curves. Instead they make up Thirsty Thelma, who doesn't exist. And look at what they've got, rising marginal cost. I've just shown you that's not the rule, that's the exception. Look at the gap between fixed costs and marginal costs in that drawing. And I emphasise, this is a drawing. It is not empirical data, including in Mascalel. Are there drawings in Mascalel? A long time since I've looked at the stupid thing. There are drawings, aren't there? Okay. There are some drawings. Most of it's mathematics, silly things. Okay. Look at the gap, how much higher marginal costs are than fixed costs. Now we know from empirical research they're much the same scale at the usual level of output. So this is not a London Tube map of corporations. It's Ptolemy's epicycles. And it's not because it's a simplification of the real world. It's assumptions they need to make a false paradigm appear to fit the data, just like Ptolemy's model of the solar system. Now, let's compare the two. There's the simplifying assumption. That's what you should draw. That's the London Tube map of the cost structure of the average corporation. This is the neoclassical fantasy model that you get instead. So, why the fantasy? They have the fantasy because according to neoclassical theory, the supply curve is the marginal cost curve above the average cost curve. That is supposed to be the supply curve. Below that point you don't supply anything, but you continue operating. So that's the supply curve. But in the real world, there's no such segment. Average total cost is greater than marginal cost all the way out. So if you look at what would happen if a real corporation with the real cost structure we know that happens in the real world, if any of those firms tried to price by setting price equal to marginal cost, which is an essential part of your model of perfect competition, if any firm did that, they would go bankrupt. They would not be covering their fixed costs. They would be losing roughly 50% on every sale, given the empirical data. So price has to be above marginal cost. And something showing price as a markup on marginal costs makes sense. You'd know if you look at examples of spreadsheets, they talk about a break-even point, and of everything past the break-even point being profit. That would be the break-even point. And the more the firm produces, the more profit. And think about it too, a little piece of realism for you that you point out that model in your textbook is nonsense. If it was true that marginal cost rose, and if it was true that you profit maximise by equating marginal cost to marginal revenue, then a major role of a sales manager would be to tell sales staff when to stop selling. Because past a certain point of sales, marginal cost would exceed marginal revenue and you'd be losing money. So a major function of a sales manager would be telling the sales staff when to stop selling. No sales manager has ever told anyone to stop selling. Any sales manager who did would be sacked. The more sales, the more profit. That's the rule for all corporations. Now this raises a problem. Why, since you have a logical argument in your textbooks about why marginal cost does rise, why does it not rise? And the basis of the argument for rising marginal cost is diminishing marginal productivity. The argument goes you have a fixed capital, fixed stock of machinery. Let's say you have 100 units of machines inside the factory. And you have variable labour, which you pay a constant wage to, and each worker is just as productive as the previous worker. There's some ideal ratio of workers to machines, let's say 10 workers per machine. Below that ratio, marginal product rises per worker. Above it, it falls. That's where diminishing marginal productivity kicks in. But all that assumes that all those machines are being used at all output levels of this corporation. And that's nonsense. If it was possible only to employ 100 workers to produce the output, you'd only use 10 machines. You'd leave the other 90 idle. If demand was enough for 700 workers, you'd use 70 machines and leave the other 30 idle. Output per worker would be constant out to the capacity of the factory. And this is the way that Eitman and Guthrie put it back in 1952. They said when manufacturing is done using factories designed by engineers, the least cost point of production for the firm is at the capacity of the factory. And therefore the short-run marginal cost curve is always below the average cost curve, all the way out to capacity. And think about it as well, when you live in a growing capitalist economy, when you first build a factory, you want it to be bigger than it needs to be for current demand. Otherwise, you have to build another factory the next day. So you always build factories with excess capacity. And if you're planning your company properly, you build another factory as demand expands. You don't use existing machines more intensively. So with idle machines below capacity, and expansion of fixed capital as well once you reach capacity, you get a linear increase in output for a linear increase in labour. Diminishing marginal productivity does not even apply, and therefore neither does rising marginal cost. That's why the logical argument you see in favour of rising marginal cost is wrong. Any factory designed by a sensible engineer doesn't experience diminishing marginal productivity in the first place. So again, it's not a simplifying assumption. It's a complicating assumption needed to make a false paradigm work. Now, would you like a numerical illustration of why that's wrong? Would that be useful? Oh, what do you think? Okay. What I'm doing here is looking at the standard drawing of rising and then falling marginal productivity.